call Charlie Dewhurst to move the motion, and I will then call the Minister to respond. There will not be an opportunity for the member in charge to wind up, as is the convention, for 30-minute debates. Order, order. Charlie Dewhurst to move the motion.
I'd like to move that this House has considered the potential merits of free-to-air access for the Six Nations Rugby Championship in 2026 and beyond. And thank you, Ms Jardine. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairship today. I'm pleased to have secured this very timely debate on the future of the Six Nations and its broadcast in the UK, as the Championship's current deal comes to an end with the BBC and ITV after this tournament. For the record, Chair, I am a former employee of the Rugby Football Union, but not since 2017. I am delighted to be joined by colleagues from across the four home nations today, but I can assure you I will not mention the results of either the England or Wales games at the weekend. There is no need to dwell on that. But I do firstly want to address the importance of the Six Nations to both rugby union and the nation. It is one of the most popular annual sporting events, and over the weekend, millions of people across the UK were watching at home and in the pub, and of course at rugby clubs around the country. It celebrates old rivalries between the home nations and inspires so many children to get involved in the game. It also fills a void in the sporting calendar during the cold and wet weekends in February and March, when there are not many other major events taking place, or indeed anything else I would be very happy to give away.
I'm sorry, I don't want to rub salt into the wound, but we had a magnificent game on Saturday and we enjoyed the victory. But others will come, there's more to go. Can I congratulate the member for Bridlington and the Wold for bringing this forward? He mentioned the critical factor. It is for me, it is for most of us. Does he agree that the UK buy-in of Olympic Games and National Pride experience is in part due to the accessibility for people to watch and become engaged? And if we are to inspire the next generation of boys and girls that the other members referred to, then that's one of the ways we need to do it.
Thank you, Chair. I absolutely agree with the honourable member. He makes a very, very good point. I will come on in some detail to the importance of the accessibility of the tournament and how indeed that inspires the next generation of fans and players. I also note that it was a really excellent match of the weekend for at least 40 minutes. But we'll leave it there if you don't mind. I want to also reference the tournament's very rich history. It was first played in 1883 as the Home Nations Championship among the then four home nations of the United Kingdom. The tournament then became the Five Nations Championship in 1910 with the addition of France, and expanded in 2000 to become the Six Nations when Italy were invited to join. Over the years, the Five and then Six Nations has provided so many iconic moments. I am, would you believe, just about old enough to remember the great Scottish Grand Slam winning side of 1990, and who can forget what Gavin Henson did to us English in 2005. On the flip side, I was lucky enough to be at the Millennium Stadium in 2017 when Elliot Daly scored that last-minute winner to break Welsh hearts. The tournament has made names like Hastings, O'Driscoll, Warburton and Atoje household names. My fear is that any future move away from free-to-air television could see audiences plummet, and we risk missing out on the next generation of rugby players and fans.
Will you give way?
I will give way, yeah, of course.
I thank the honourable gentleman for securing this really important debate. But according to a recent study by Choosing Active Role Models to Inspire Girls, only 28% of 14-year-olds were able to identify a sporting role model. So does the honourable member agree with me that if the women's Six Nations follows that of the men's game and moves behind a paywall, it would limit girls' access to the sport, reduce visibility and ultimately harm efforts to grow women's participation in rugby?
Thank the honourable member for that. I absolutely agree. Rugby, the women's rugby game has been a huge success story over the last decade, and that free-to-air coverage which we have of the Women's Six Nations has been a key part of that. I also want to pay tribute to all the clubs up and down the country that have done such a huge amount of work to get more girls and women into the game and to play it. Now, going back to what I was saying about the free-to-air access across the board, obviously, as we know, all current matches are shown on BBC and ITV. Now, that ensures that the sport has a vital window to the wider population, and this is key to keeping it in the national spotlight. Chair, it's worth recalling that the last comprehensive free-to-air broadcast deal for Test cricket was the 2005 Ashes series, arguably the greatest of all time. But I question, however, whether that roller coaster summer of cricket would have grabbed the nation's attention in the same way had it not been accessible to all. Since then, cricketing authorities have been battling with the survival of the Test format 20 years after it went behind a paywall. They have had to invent, and should I call it, a new gimmick format for free-to-air television in an attempt to win back the next generation of fans. But thankfully today is not a debate about the pros and cons of the 100. So I will return to the matters in hand. We could, maybe that's an opportunity for later in the year, we could return to Westminster Hall. Chair, there were several reports in the media last week that a deal between the Six Nations and TNT Sport for 2026 coverage and beyond was imminent. I'm very grateful to the Six Nations for providing me with clarification on this point, and I can confirm that these reports are inaccurate, as any deal has yet to go out to tender. It does, however, set the backdrop for today's debate, and it will be vital that any new deal maintains free-to-air coverage. I will give way on.
For bringing this debate today is very, very timely. And would he agree with me, though, that the Six Nations really do need to ensure that there is a balance between reach and revenue when entering into these conversations with broadcasters?
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for that intervention. It is very timely into what I'm about to come on to say, and I'm very grateful for the honourable member's contribution to today's debate, given her role in Parliament in rugby and her previous role in the sport as well. So thank you very much. Now, as was alluded to there, I'm very aware that income from broadcast deals is vital to the home nations rugby unions, but I would caution against a dash to the highest bidder. It should not be the case of maximising income, but optimising it so that the sport continues to have a broad reach, which in turn creates more fans. Matches involving... Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think the decision would run counter to the aim of increasing engagement in the sport. He will know that the RFU is in receipt of £28 million of taxpayers' money to deliver the Women's Rugby World Cup, but also to improve engagement in the women's game. But is he aware that the joint venture between the Rugby World Cup and the RFU to deliver the tournament awarded the contract to provide the equipment to Rhino Rugby, a long-term RFU sponsor, in return for them paying £800,000, in return for them being paid £800,000. And they were selected ahead of Aramis Rugby, who offered to deliver all of the equipment for free. I wonder if the gentleman agrees with me that the government should do more to monitor how taxpayers' money is being spent and whether or not it's in the interest of growing the game.
The honourable member for his intervention. I think we can all agree we're looking forward to the Women's World Cup. The situation which he alludes to is not something I'm aware of the detail, but I'm sure it's something the Minister will take an interest with, and hopefully you can meet and discuss it further. Now, matches involving the Six Nations, involving the home nations, are shown free-to-air during the Six Nations, have significantly outperformed viewing figures for example, the autumn internationals on subscription services showing the same countries. If rugby risks its broader fan base, then it will become harder to attract other sponsors and therefore becomes counterproductive in the long term. These are, of course, commercial decisions for private organisations, but Parliament does have a say through the listed sporting events. The Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport has powers using the Broadcasting Act 1996 to draw up a list of sporting events of national interest. I would be delighted.
Diolch yn fawr. In Wales, rugby, of course, is a part of our culture and national identity. And international tournaments like the Six Nations are an integral part of our national calendar. Caerfyrddin, my constituency, has produced a plethora of first-class players, far too many to name, although perhaps I should drop one or two in, such as in the past glory days of Roy Burgess and Delmy Thomas, but more recently Shane Williams, phenomenal player, Mike Phillips, and even up to date to Gareth Davies, and many, many, many more. But does the honourable member agree that win or lose, as has been our case at the moment, rugby brings us all together in Wales and should be included in Group A? And of course, the free-to-view is also so important for S4C, who produces our Welsh language, our Welsh medium coverage for sport. But they need to be included. This tournament needs to be included in Group A.
Thank you very much. I couldn't agree more with the Honourable Lady, and I do hope that her local clubs will play a key role in the rebuild of the national side, and hopefully there'll be a few more victories in future. Returning to the listed events, the broadcast rights to those listed events must be offered to the main free-to-air terrestrial broadcasters on fair and reasonable terms. The aim is to ensure that these events are made available to all television viewers, and they are placed into Groups A and B, as was just alluded to. Any Group A events must be shown in full and live by the qualifying broadcaster, but Group B can have live coverage on subscription services as long as the highlights are then provided to free-to-air terrestrial broadcasters. Currently, Group A events include the Olympic and Paralympic Games, the Men's and Women's Football World Cup Finals Tournament, the Men's and Women's European Football Championship Tournaments, the FA Cup Final, the Scottish FA Cup Final in Scotland, Grand National, Wimbledon Tennis Finals, the Rugby Union World Cup Final, the Derby, and the Rugby League Challenge Cup Final. Group B, which only needs highlights, as I mentioned, on free-to-air, is Test cricket matches played in England, non-finals play in Wimbledon, all other matches in the Rugby Union World Cup Finals Tournament, the Commonwealth Games, the World Athletics Championship, the Cricket World Cup, where home nations are playing in the final or semi-final, the Ryder Cup, the Open Golf Championship, and the Six Nations. Now, in terms of basic viewing figures, the Six Nations outperforms a number of events already in Group A. England games regularly have in excess of 4 million viewers, which is higher than either the Derby or the Rugby League Challenge Cup Final. I will do. Yeah.
Congratulations on securing this debate. You mentioned previously about your previous occupation. We've had this discussion before when the RFU did a deal for England home games in the Six Nations, and I think it was for away games against France as well. And we saw a real big difference in viewership figures falling from average at that point 4 or 5 million to just 2 million for those England games. When Six Nation games now are averaging 8 million, that would be a huge return if we were to go back to those sorts of numbers. And so maybe that is something that the RFU and those making this decision should keep in mind, particularly when we're trying to get as many people to watch these games as possible.
Very much indeed for that intervention. I agree with the Honourable Gentleman, but it's really important that we actually, the timings of the games and everything else in terms of optimising that broadcast number, because as we've seen various experiments in recent years, whether it's Friday nights or Sunday afternoons, that has a bearing as well as a traditional, say, Saturday afternoon kick-off. So that all needs to be taken into account, and I'm sure it will be as those negotiations progress in the coming months. Now, the tournament itself, as has just been mentioned, attracts around 120 million viewers in total, a clear demonstration of its popularity. And my own view is that the Six Nations matches involving the home countries should be moved from Group B to Group A to ensure that this much-loved tournament continues to have the broadest possible reach. This is vital for the health of the game from elite level down to the grassroots. Watching our international teams through free-to-air coverage of the Six Nations is often the only exposure fans will have to professional rugby. For many of us across the UK, the opportunity to watch elite club rugby in person is a postcode lottery. My own constituency of Bridlington and the Wolds in East Yorkshire is equidistant from 3 of the closest English Premiership teams. They are Leicester, Newcastle and Sale. So anyone with the vaguest grasp of geography will know that none of those are remotely close to where I live. So in my part of the world, it's the grassroots game that is the bedrock of local rugby. Clubs like Bridlington, Driffield, Hornsey and Pocklington do an incredible job introducing hundreds of boys and girls to the sport every year, ensuring the continued strength of the amateur game. Driffield, to take one example, fields 6 senior teams, 4 men's and 2 ladies, and has minis and juniors at every age group from under 6 to under 16s. These are the very epitome of community sports clubs. But many of those kids only gave rugby a go because they wanted to be the next Marcus Smith, the next Finn Russell, the next Liam Williams. I would suggest that watching the Six Nations and being inspired by it is a huge part of that pathway to taking up the sport. Chair, my final point is less about sport and more about our United Kingdom and our friends in Ireland, France and Italy. No other tournament pits England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales against each other every year in such a high-profile event. All of us love to use these games to bring up old rivalries and have a cheap dig at our neighbours. But it is an occasion that shows there is so much more that unites us than divides us.
On that point, I thank the honourable member for giving way, particularly on that point, because rugby does bring us together, but we cannot we cannot, and I refer to my register of interests, we cannot ignore the financial challenges as faced by the sport that we love in all of the home nations and overseas. So would he agree with me that it is so important that public sector broadcasting comes to the table and is able to be competitive and able to provide a future so that grassroots sport and our future generations keep playing rugby and have a love of the sport that we all do in this hall today?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Chair. I couldn't have put it better myself. It is so important that we get that balance right between ensuring that our unions have a secure financial future and that the game is available to the widest possible audience. And both those things should be a symbiotic, positive relationship that ensure the healthy future of the game across the United Kingdom. So thank you. Sport has a unique ability to be a force for good, and the Six Nations does it as well as any event. I hope the Minister will take this opportunity to consider the importance of the tournament to both Rugby Union and the United Kingdom, and I call on her to review the listed sporting events and put the Six Nations in the top tier where it belongs.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, Ms Jardine. I am pleased to respond to this debate, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for Bridlington and the Wold for securing it here and for such a very good speech. Rugby Union has a vital role to play in our national identity around the United Kingdom. The Six Nations is a jewel in the crown of international rugby union. Each year, the competition manages to deliver unpredictable and compelling storylines that captivate audiences across the globe. There are few events that drive the same level of anticipation. It brings the parts of our country together in fierce but fair rivalry, as he concluded his speech to that effect. Through comprehensive broadcast coverage spanning 209 international territories, the 2023 Championship reached over 121 million viewers who tuned in to watch the action unfold. Now, I will only make a brief mention of the weekend, and that is to congratulate Scotland and Ireland for their impressive wins, and I very much hope that England and Wales can bounce back next weekend. As well as the success of the men's Six Nations, in recent years, the women's Six Nations has risen to prominence and inspired young girls and women across the country. I'm delighted that England will be hosting the 10th edition of the Women's Rugby World Cup this year between August and September. The opening game will take place at the Stadium of Light, with the final scheduled to be held at Twickenham, and I look forward to cheering on the Red Roses and the other home countries. I will give right, yes.
Thank the Minister for giving way, and what she's just spoken about now, about the Women's Six Nations and the Rugby World Cup, is absolutely tremendous. The Six Nations, literally, and Rugby Union goes from this exciting time of year in February through to the Women's World Cup, the Women's Six Nations, which follows on from the Men's Six Nations. Then we have the Lions, then we have the Women's World Cup. It is so exciting. There is such a tension around this. That is why this deal that is had about the paywall or not to paywall is so important at this time of year. So I urge her to have as many conversations for a positive outcome for everybody.
Well, I'm incredibly grateful for the Honourable Member for her contribution, and of course I pay tribute to all her work in this subject. We've talked about this many times, and she's absolutely right. It spans throughout the year. I was really lucky to be cheering on the Red Roses at Twickenham a few months ago with my former boss, a former member of this House, Sylvia Heel, and I look forward to doing so again in the coming months. And I'm going to come on to touch on some of the points she makes in her intervention in a moment, because I am of course aware of reports relating to the broadcasting of the Six Nations from 2026 onwards, and that's obviously why the Honourable Member has brought this timely debate as he framed it. It should be emphasised that this is a live issue, and it wouldn't be appropriate to comment on every single stage of ongoing commercial negotiations, and I'm sure him and other members will appreciate that. However, I did recently meet Six Nations Rugby to discuss this issue further, and it was clear to me that Six Nations Rugby understands the strength of feeling among rugby fans relating to this issue and appreciates the significant cultural and financial contribution that the Six Nations makes to each nation's rugby union's governing body, including the RFU. Indeed, the government recognises the importance of broadcasting sporting events like the Six Nations to attract significant audience interest. Now, the Honourable Member proposed changes to the so-called listed events regime that would, in their view, protect free-to-air coverage of the Six Nations. Now, as he outlined, the Broadcasting Act 1996 gives the Secretary of State for DCMS the power to draw up a list of sporting events of national interest. The broadcast rights to these events must be offered to main free-to-air terrestrial broadcasters on a fair and reasonable terms. The current listed events regime is designed to ensure that sporting events of national significance are available to as wide an audience as possible by prohibiting exclusive broadcasting of the event without prior consent of Ofcom. Now, as colleagues will know, the Six Nations is listed under the Act as a Group B protected event, meaning highlights must be offered to free-to-air broadcasters. However, full live coverage does not need to be made available to free-to-air broadcasters. Now, listing does not guarantee that that event will be broadcast live or on a free-to-air channel. Rights holders are not required to sell live rights for listed events, and free-to-air broadcasters are not obliged to purchase them. Conversely, the example of the Six Nations demonstrates that putting an event in Group B does not prevent a rights holder from selling full live coverage rights to a free-to-air broadcaster or broadcasters. Now, the government believes that the current list of events does work well, and it strikes an appropriate balance between access to sporting events and allowing sports to maximise broadcasting revenue, and therefore the government has no plans to review the list at this time. But when discussing the Six Nations, it's important to consider that broadcasting income is a significant revenue stream for rugby union, important for the financial sustainability of all the home nations unions. The current broadcasting rights are said to be worth £90 million a year, a significant revenue stream for the 6 rugby governing bodies. Now, the previous government loaned Premiership clubs £124 million as part of the sport survival package to keep elite level rugby union alive during the pandemic. Championship clubs were loaned £5 million. And we are supporting rugby union authorities to improve the financial sustainability of the sport. And indeed, I recently met with the RFU to discuss the future of rugby union. I will give way, yes.
I thank the Minister for giving way. She makes valid points about the contribution the government has made, but the RFU also lost £30 million and has overseen the 3 Premiership clubs going bust. So I would question whether or not the government is doing enough to scrutinise the governing bodies of the game in England.
I did take note of his earlier intervention. If it would be helpful, I'm very happy to write to him about the specific points that he's put on the record. Because I do welcome recent progress made within the game on funding distribution, among other issues. We will continue to work with the RFU, representatives of Premiership clubs and Championship clubs, and the wider sports sector to support the ongoing sustainability of elite and community-level rugby. And more broadly, the DCMS provides the majority of direct support for grassroots sport through our arm's-length body, Sport England, which annually invests over £250 million of national lottery and government money. Sport England has awarded the RFU £30,859,000 for the period of 22-27 as one of Sport England's long-term system partners to support men's and women's grassroots rugby union. The DCMS has also provided over £28 million of investment to support England hosting the 2025 Women's Rugby World Cup, including £14.5 million to support the legacy of the tournament via improvements in facilities and greater opportunities for women and girls at all levels. Now, despite the support to date, the RFU is independent of government and is responsible for the regulation of rugby union at all levels. Given the financial difficulties facing rugby union, it is right that the RFU and Six Nations consider the trade-offs between visibility, access to games, maximising revenue and protecting our cultural heritage. I will give way, yes.
I really appreciate the Minister for her generosity of time, but does she agree with me that it is vital that the Six Nations coverage be available in the Welsh language for those watching it in Wales? And also, as you know, my honourable friend from Caerphilly has mentioned that it is different in Wales. Rugby is different. The viewing figures are higher, and also it is such a huge part of our culture. Would she agree to meet with BBC Wales, ITV Wales, and S4C to ensure that those conversations about the Welsh language are being heard?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady, and of course I know in Wales 80% of the population watch the Six Nations Rugby. I think Six Nations Rugby are very conscious of this. They're taking many steps to make sure they protect Welsh language broadcast, and I know they're looking at options going forward, but I'd be very happy to meet with the organisations, and indeed I do in my role as Media Minister, but very happy to take that forward with her. Because it is understandable that the potential of the Six Nations moving away from free-to-air television does attract a great deal of scrutiny and concern from fans. The government and I am very, very aware of that. And it's right that RFU and Six Nations Rugby take a considered and balanced approach, recognising the need to achieve reach with existing and new fans, the importance that the Six Nations has for cultural pride of each of the home nations, all while maximising the much-needed broadcast revenue. So in closing, this debate has been a brilliant opportunity to discuss the continued success of the Six Nations, and I'd like to once again thank the Honourable Member who has tabled today's debate and all the members who have attended and taken part.
The question is that this House has considered the potential merits of free-to-view access for the Six Nations Rugby Championship in 2026 and beyond. As many are of that opinion, say aye. Aye. And the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting is now suspended until 2:30 p.m.